Ladies and gentlemen, we're just about to start our panel, so if you kindly be seated, we will begin momentarily. Oh, thank you, that was quick enough. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first International Marmara Urban Forum, which is being held under the title Cities Developing Solutions. My name is Ayşe Suberker. I'll be your moderator throughout this panel. I'm a journalist for almost 2 decades on TV, and I'm currently the host of a TRT World's Straight Talk program, which is considered a flagship program, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So, as you know, on this very occasion, Marmara Municipalities Union, with an international perspective, managed to gather professionals from cities, regional and local governments, private sectors, NGOs, and universities from all around the world. The forum, which is being held for the very first time, comes after a few days when an earthquake measuring 5.8 or 5.9 on the Richter scale jolted Istanbul. Luckily, no one was killed except for minor injuries, but that event was enough to send millions of people to the streets without knowing about what to do during the earthquake and aftermath. So today, in our panel today, I'm joined by distinguished professionals whose expertise correspond the very needs of Istanbul, including, as I just mentioned, earthquake and aftermath. So for the next 60 minutes, we'll be discussing the importance of public spaces for people from all walks of life, their pivotal role into social integration, acknowledgement, and recognition of differences not only contribute to the physical and psychological health of the community, but also add value to the city for its commercial and cultural activities. So before going any further, let me introduce our panelists as I kindly invite them to the floor. Mrs. Anuela Ristani, she is the Deputy Mayor of Tiran Municipality. Please be seated. Mrs. Doris Gstach, Professor in Open Space and Landscape Planning in the University of Applied Sciences in Erfurt. Mrs. Ebru Firidin Özgür, Associate Professor, Mimar Sinan Fine Arts University. Mrs. Hatice Ayataç, Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning, Istanbul Technical University. And finally, a gentleman, Mr. Uğur İnan. He is the advisor to the Mayor of Fatih Municipality. Oh, he's not here? I thought I just saw him here. Okay, so we will start our panel with Mrs. Anuela Ristani. She's going to talk about placemaking in cities, right? The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm not sure I can make this work, but if somebody shows me how to. Okay. Okay, great. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful city. It's been an eventful trip for me personally. I lost my luggage last night, so I went a little bit on a tour today to be presentable. And so I was talking to one of these local salespeople, and I always want to ask for jokes whenever I'm in a new city. And I said, you know, what's a good joke for Istanbul? And he said, what do you do? And I said, oh, well, I work for the city of Tirana, so I work with cities. I'm the deputy mayor. And so he said, well, I'm going to tell you a joke about citizens. I said, go ahead. And he asked me a question. What do you call the perfect Istanbul citizen? I wasn't sure. And so, you know, I guessed a couple of times. He said, Turkish delight. So that was a little bit to cheer me up for, you know, all of the adventure I've had. But jokes aside, it's great to be here. This is one of my favorite cities in the world. I think it has so much life and so much energy. And it's definitely the best place to talk about cities. So today I just want to share with you a little bit of what we've been doing in Tirana, which is very similar both culturally and, I know, behaviorally with Istanbul, but which also needs to, other than had an earthquake just like you guys did, also needs to cope with this finding space, making space for all of the citizens so that the space is both democratic and it makes sense in the urban development, which is basically what we do for a living. So for those of you who don't know where we are, this is a little bit of history. The reason why we're similar is because for 500 years we were under the Ottoman Empire, and then for 50 years we are the black hole of Europe, or the North Korea of Europe. And then now we're somewhere in this ambiguous pre-entrance, pre-exit, after-exit, free entrance in Europe. So that just to give you a little bit of a context. But we had a plan. We're a young city. Next year, we're going to be 100 years old. And so this is to show you how small we were before the city developed. This is basically, I don't know, a fraction of one of the neighborhoods here in Istanbul. But that's basically what Tirana was 100 years ago, roughly 5,000 inhabitants. And this was the urban plan. But then things happened. We became the capital, and obviously everybody wanted to gravitate right in the center of the country where everything was going on. And a city was established. So I'm going to show you some maps, aerial maps of the city and how fast it grew. So eventually in the late 90s, late 80s, early 90s, this was the city seen from above. Then by mid-90s, it grew like this. And then in the 2000s, and then this is where we picked it up from. So you can imagine we went from a city of 200,000 people to a city of 1 million over less than 15 years. So that is a little bit of a shock for those of you who work in urban development and who take care of cities and their organization. So when we got in the office, we found a place that was a little bit chaotic. It had grown in terms of life and in terms of economy, in terms of people, but not, it hadn't gone along with the sense of the urban development. So the first thing was space. Everybody was fighting for space. You know, everybody was grabbing as much space as they could find in the streets for their businesses. They were pushing their fences further, you know, for their homes. Because obviously, you know, even in here, when we got in here, everybody had occupied their seats. So obviously, we want all of us have this inner desire to make our own space and have our own territory. So we are territorial as human beings. So that was the first thing that we encountered. So that's, you know, where do you start? So we thought, you know what, we cannot change the entire city and all the shock that it has been going through in the last years, but we can start from the center. And so we started right from the Skanderbeg Square. And by the way, for those of you who know a little bit of history, Skanderbeg was Turkish as well. So, and then they fought the Ottoman Empire, but that's another story to tell. But this was where what our center looked like in the early 80s. During communism, there was no private property, so there were no private cars other than public transport. So if you see very carefully, somewhere in there you see a bus, but that's about it. So everybody could walk. We're very healthy, I mean, in that sense. But yeah, so the center was basically the space for everybody, for all the citizens, and it was free for them. Then things changed a little bit. After the Berlin Wall collapsed, you could actually buy a car. So people started to buy their own cars, and that space kind of got a little bit invaded. So before, it was all pedestrian. Now it's half pedestrian, but with a little bit of risk, because there right in the middle, you can still have cars going by. And then that craze of basically having, it went like this. So before, there was some space for pedestrians, and then after, because the cars were so invasive, there was very little. So this was actually how it looked like outside my office the first day we got in the office. So it was a little bit of a job to do. But the thing is, if you think about space in terms of democracy, in Albania especially, we only have 15% of people who own a car. And if you think about this in terms of invasion, that's not 15% of the space. That's not 50% of transition. So for 85% of people who don't own cars, their space is invaded because these people have basically a object that prioritize more than human placemaking, more than space making for citizens. And so that was a concept of the initial idea where we started from. So we said, you know what, we're gonna just do this pedestrian, the way it used to be, but not just the way it used to be, but the way it makes sense. Because if the majority of people are pedestrians, then we cannot have cars take their space. So this is what it looked like before, and I'm trying to push this. Anybody help? This is what it looked like after. This was done in 10 months, but to be really fair, some infrastructure work had been done years ago, so it wasn't completely from scratch. This was the first day when we opened. We had an event, so it's pretty empty. But then, as we opened the gates, it looked like, I want to show you how it looked like, but it's not moving. Oops, sorry. It just ruined my surprise, like this. And then in the evening, it looked like this. And then for all the surrounding areas, because we live in this time of really crazy temperatures, we thought that it cannot just be concrete and flat material. So 50% of the square is, we planted, I think it was 30,000, I have my colleagues here from the urban development, 30,000 plants, so that it would mitigate the rising temperatures during the summer especially, and then it has also water features so that it cools down when the sun is at its peak. So this is how the garden looked like when we opened it, and this is how it looks when there are actually people there. Here it goes. And then obviously, since the space is free for everybody to access and there is no cars going by, you can use it for everything. So kids have their own space. You can use your bikes or rollerblades or skateboards and everything like that. So it is a democratic space. This is how it looks in the evening, and there's no event going on. It's just any evening like any other evening, because when there is an event going on, it looks like this. So obviously, there's a lot of placemaking, there's a lot of space for people, and it's public, and it's free, and it's for everybody to, and it's a little bit more democratic, I should add. Yeah, and then it's the peak. But yeah, but this is like any normal day. Then we thought, you know what, we cannot just stop at the center. There are some iconic little centers in the city that they need to get to the same logic as well. So for everybody in this region, we know that how important the bazaar is a place, the marketplace. It's a place where people talk to each other, get the latest news, buy their produce, and we love to buy our produce in an open space. And so it's a social institution, but it's also a space that is infrastructurally very important, and it creates a lot of economy and a lot of local economy especially. So the new bazaar was a very rundown area. It is less than 100 meters away from what I just showed you, away from the center, so that it cannot just be like this. And it was our next project, where from here we went to here, and from here we went to here. So not only it is a center for people to do business, from 30 businesses, they went up to 1,000, and I think it's 1,200 right now as we speak. But so it's not just economically viable, but it's also a space for people to access. No cars going by, you can go with your kids, have a coffee, have lunch, buy your produce, and then chat about, you know, the neighbor upstairs, if you wish. And so all the space where people sell during the day, during the evening, everything is cleared out, and we have events. We've had fashion shows in there and screen showings of movies. So it's basically a space to do everything you want during the day and the evening. And then, okay, this is just a cute picture. We did the same thing with a castle, some of these iconic castles that were privately owned, because we did, we transformed public spaces, then they went and replicated the same model into private spaces. So that is a private investment of a rundown space, which is now full of businesses and full of people, again, in the same model. And then we did the same for everything that was in the surroundings. So this is the youth park that's just being reconstructed. And then we thought, you know what though? The city has had no infrastructure for at least 30 years. So it grew in the same backbone from 200,000 people to 1 million. And it never had a new infrastructure. So basically people are coming, they're sprawling, they're building their own homes, some legally, some illegally. But then the roads are going after the homes are built. We cannot have that going on in the 21st century. So I said, you know what, we're gonna just double the boulevard. So the Boulevard of Albania, this was constructed by Mussolini in the early, so 1920s. And so Mussolini had his supervisor going and checking out the works. So the Italians built the boulevard in the city that I was telling you, which was a village of 5,000 people. And the supervisor writes a letter to Mussolini and says, man, I've been everywhere in the world, and I've seen lots of cities without a boulevard, but I've never seen a boulevard without a city. So they basically built the infrastructure, and then the city came, but that had happened 100 years ago. And right now, where we got to manage it, basically, there was not such a development, so all development was casual. So the new boulevard now is an extension of the original one, and because of this democratic principle of space that I was telling you about, it is really constructed with a mind of using 85% of the space for the people and then 15 of it for the cars. So car lanes are very limited, are not more extended. So if the boulevard is 70 meters, the car lanes are only the basic 2 lanes for each side, but then all the other space is just pedestrians, it's bike lanes, and obviously is invaded by people during the day and night. This is how it looks like. Then the thing with space is also that it has to create joy. So the next chapter for us was kids. In the development of the city, we have this, it's very important for us to start from the principle that if it works for a kid and if it works for the elderly, then it works for all of us. Our cities are built mainly with the idea of working for the working people, working for adults, for people our size. But if you're thinking about kids and from their perspective, from the 90 centimeter perspective of a healthy 3-year-old, or from the perspective of a lady who has limited accessibility, then maybe our cities would look a little different. And the next thing we thought was, so yes, we make space, we make pedestrian space, we make space for everybody who will walk, but what do the kids do? And we found out that there was no playground in the city, no public playground in the city. So we said, you know what? Every space where we see that there is enough potential, or there is a neighborhood, or there's an idle space where they maybe park cars, or things like that, we're gonna make it a playground. So we started with the first one, which was the largest one, which was the one before, and then we moved on to every single neighborhood. So this is before, this is after, and it's the same space. And we made it a deal in our office that for 4 years of our work, so for 48 months, we're gonna have every month 1 playground. So by the end of our first 4 years, we basically managed to have 48 playgrounds for the city of Tirana. Then another project I wanted to talk to you about, which is not so much about space, but about space quality, is also this initiative about the trees. By 2030, because of our initial urban plan, we have planned to plant 2 million trees that are going to be a natural barrier to the city and to its development. So it's very difficult for every of you who works in the municipalities to budget that kind of money for trees only. We have a lot of projects, we have sewage, we have water, we have all these responsibilities, and at the end of the day, the budget is the same. So we thought, you know what, we're gonna work with the yeast concept. And the yeast concept is, we plant the idea, and then we make others participate. So with the trees, we could barely budget a couple of thousand of trees every year. But we said, we're gonna make this a national phenomenon. Every kid for his birthday should plant a tree. And it's the best gift you could give to your child. And so soon enough, it became so cool that you really weren't cool if you had the newest iPad in class. But if you know all the kids in class had planted a tree, then you're going to ask your mom and dad, it's like, I want to plant my own tree. And then you're part of that project, you're part of that development because it's yours. So it's not just like the city plants it and you have to take care of it, but it's you who plant it, and obviously you cannot vandalize it and destroy it.
Ms. Ristani, I'm so sorry.
I know, I'm sorry. This is my last project. It's my
okay.
5 in the morning. So, so this is a trees I wanted to show you about. I wish I had cooler pictures. And then the last project I wanted to share, and the newest one, and I'm going to close with that, is we had this famous mausoleum. If you Google Albania, you'll find about Enver Hoxha and his psyche about having, you know, this pyramid built for himself. And this was conceived for him. And then in the early 90s, it went through a lot of transformation. It was used for disco, for NATO headquarters, for all sorts of use. And our newest project is to basically transform it into a digital tech hub. But that's not what I want to show you today. The reason for it is because not only is going to be used for the kids, almost 5,000 kids per month will be taught digital literacy, animation, and those skills that are very, very coherent. But it is an open space where we can have events and people can access it from all sides. And with all the surrounding areas, it can basically be used multi-purposefully, day and night, for both parks and recreation and events and all sorts of things. That was the last project I want to show you. I have a few more pictures, but I guess we can talk. Thank you very much, and thank you for bearing with me with the technical challenges.
We thank Ristani for telling about her city's transformation throughout the years. Our next panelist is Mrs. Gstach. I guess you're going to talk about what we need the most in Istanbul. It's public green space provision, right? And small parks and environmental justice. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. All right. I think this is probably a good match with the presentation we just heard. I will continue talking about green space, and as you see in my title, I will focus on small parks, and I will tell you, I try to explain why, from my understanding, from my research, we should draw especially attention to these small parks when we talk about environmental justice. We have seen in the previous presentation already that green spaces have various positive effects on the quality of life. They are important places for social cohesion. They are places of recreation, sports and play, the playgrounds we have just heard about. And green spaces, of course, also help to reduce things like heat islands effect. Tree plantings are important. As we are facing climate change, this is a very urgent topic, actually. In addition, trees also help us to clean the air. So there are a lot of ecosystem services, as we call them, which can help us to make life more pleasant in cities. All these aspects contribute to physical, mental, and social health. So we can state that green spaces are very important for our well-being in urban settings. And if green spaces are public, they are especially important and valuable because they are open to all parts of the society alike. In recent years, we have paid more attention to environmental conditions and how they affect different parts of society. In this context, so now I have to try to figure out here. Does it work?
It's not working?
I'm not sure. Let's try.
Excuse me. Could you help us?
I do it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, here we are. Yeah? All right. Okay. In recent years, we have paid more attention to environmental conditions and how they affect different parts of society. In this context, the term of environmental justice was defined. Here's a brief definition of what that means. Environmental justice means that environmental benefits, as well as the burdens, have to be shared fairly. A burden, for example, could be the exposure to polluted air. If you think of very busy streets and people living along this very busy street, they might have worse conditions than people living in a very calm and green area. A benefit would be, for example, good access to a nice green space, a nice park, a nice playground. So, as environmental justice can further be broken down to 3 dimensions. I briefly want to address their relation to public green space. First of all, there is distributive justice, meaning just or suitable distribution of unavoidable environmental burdens as well as environmental resources. Equitable access means that we have equal access to environmental resources. When we talk about green spaces, this would then mean where are the green spaces, how much of it is there, and who has access to them, which quality do they have. There is a third dimension which is very important, here we are. There's a third dimension which is the procedural justice aspect, meaning equal opportunities to contribute and participate in the development of green spaces or in environmental resources. As I said, this is a very important aspect, but I won't focus on this, but will further go on focusing on the distributive justice and equitable access in my presentation here. This is the historic district of Savannah in Georgia, US. It was planned in 1733 by James Oglethorpe. So you see that the distribution and the thought of, let's say, provision of green space as a major aspect of urban structure is not a new thought. In the 19th century, approaches of first provision standards came up and were introduced into urban planning. It became more common in policies throughout Europe and also the US. The goal was to create human living conditions, and this is a goal I guess we are still heading towards. The standards which are used, well, they might have changed slightly, but we are still using them today. We might ask ourselves, do they have any effect? I mean, it's standards, so this is not something mandatory we have to follow. But there is a recent study that shows that actually standards do really make a difference. The study was undertaken by the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. The study looked at green space policies over the last 25 years in 50 cities in Europe, Canada, and the US. And there was a clear picture that if cities have such standards defined, they obviously have a better provision with green spaces and a more fair share, if you will, throughout the cities. So I think this gives quite an evidence that it's not just something we are trying to define and it doesn't help much, but it makes a difference. Also in Germany, many larger cities apply such green space provision standards. They are the basis of citywide open space analysis. I show you 2 examples here of such analysis things. Analysis is very important, and for doing the analysis you need these standards. Analysis is very important to understand where are gaps in provision throughout the city, because we are, I guess, all aware that this is not evenly distributed throughout the city. So we become aware where action is needed most. Typical features defined are like square meters per capita, ratio of green space, say 10 square meters per person in the city, also minimum sizes and maximum distances to the different types of green spaces are important to distinguish. So it's not all the same, of course. In addition, a good analysis also considers specifics such as the urban structure. Think of different urban structures, like there is a single family house area, which definitely has other needs towards public spaces than very dense urban structures where very many people live. And also there are vulnerable groups like families, elderly or low-income people who have different needs, and they are very much dependent on close-by good service with green spaces. So it's not all the same. You have to distinguish and you have to be clear what your goals are in these policies then. Park standards normally distinguish different sizes of parks, and you see I'm coming closer to my core topic. They are varying from large city parks down to small neighborhood parks. Large city parks serve large areas, meaning that people accept longer distances to reach this park. They go there occasionally, they go there probably on a weekend and spend half a day there. They are very important places in the city. We also have seen this in the previous presentation, I think, very well. And they are a treasure to each city. But on the other hand, or on the other end of the scale, there are small parks which have correspondingly small service areas, a small service radius. They serve a neighborhood and provide places for everyday life and frequent uses, like on a daily basis. They are everyday places. It's on this level where we see more differences between neighborhoods. Well-off neighborhoods tend to be well-served with green spaces, whereas poorer neighborhoods are more likely to show gaps in provision. Wow, I'm too quick, sorry. So, it's the small parks which make the difference in terms of environmental justice. But despite this relevance, they normally get little attention. Anne Forsyth, a well-known American researcher in urban design, and her colleagues call them the stepchild of park provision. I want to focus on this stepchild. First of all, what do we have to consider when talking about small parks? Going with smaller sizes, proximity to them is essential. The smaller, the closer, you could probably say. If they are not close by, people tend to stay away. There is a very interesting Denmark-wide representative study who looked at the use patterns of green spaces, and they found out that if green spaces, public green spaces, are further away than 300 meters from the people, they tend to use them much less. So if they're closer than 300 meters, they really are used on a very regular basis, several times a week. After 300 meters, there is really a breakdown, and the frequency decreases quite rapidly. So while there is some evidence concerning a considerable distance, this is true internationally, but also within Germany. Discussions on size seem especially critical in today's growing cities, with the growing building densities. In Germany, there is currently a discussion going on to define nationwide standards to somehow compare the cities, be able to compare them. And the recommendation for the smallest unit for the neighborhood parks is at least 1 hectare. This is argued with the opinion that sizes which are smaller than that would not allow for comprehensive recreation and multifunctional uses, active uses and passive uses as well. But at the same time, a couple of cities use different standards and going down to like 0.5 hectare or 0.3 hectare even. So there are a lot of opinions, but there is not a clear picture. In order to get a clearer picture of the role these small parks have and how far they can serve the multiple uses and recreation demands we have in our neighborhoods, I did a little empirical study to take a closer look and have a better understanding, have a basis for further decisions.
Ms. Gstach, last 3 minutes.
Okay. I briefly want to go into the results. I looked at 3 cities with 500,000 inhabitants in Germany. You see the 3 cities on the top right. I looked at 4 neighborhood parks. They have a size of about 0.6 hectare. And did surveys with users and a lot of observations in the parks to get a clearer pictures about the patterns of use and appropriation. Very briefly, some findings. The parks clearly show to be an everyday place. 60%, around 60% come several times a week or even every day. Here we see the mix of uses. So you see there are multiple uses possible in these small parks. It's not just like a passive area, it's not just like a calm, quiet area or an active playground, sports field or something like this, but you can, even in these small sizes, you can mix these uses quite well and people can fulfill different demands they have. And finally, very interesting, I find that people really get in touch with each other because they, not just because they know the people they see and meet in the park, but they also get in touch with strangers. They have little conversations with them. So the small parks obviously have a lot to contribute to quality of life in the city. Conclusions. If we want to create a livable city for all parts of society, we have to consider these small parks. Talking about green space aspects and about environmental justice is not the large parks which make the difference because we tend to have them. It's not that they are not valuable, we have them. But what we don't have are the small parks close by, not everywhere. So, let's say kind of recommendations from my side. If you want to create a livable city for all parts of society, plan small green spaces close to where people live and where they really need them, where the vulnerable groups live. Take care of good accessibility, meaning a reasonable distance, meaning a close distance. And finally, of course, design them well so that they really can serve the needs of people. Oops, sorry. Thank you very much for your attention.
We thank you, Ms. Gstach. She actually underlined the importance of small parks in cities, which are often neglected, and she brought the importance of environmental justice, which we all seek. The first two panelists drew a broader picture, but now we're going to get focused on our city, Istanbul. Our next panelist is Mrs. Hatice Ayataç. She'll be talking about sustainable public place development performance of local administrations in Istanbul. Ms. Ayataç, you have 15 minutes, please.
Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to greet you all. Well, the main topic of this meeting is cities developing solutions. So I will talk about what kind of evaluation is made. By the way, this is the wrong presentation, so let's change the slides. Sorry for that. Yes, I can go on. Well, we are talking about cities developing solutions. So we want to see what kind of better and more constructive solutions we can have for our cities. The previous two speakers also focused on this. What I want to say is that local administrations in Istanbul, can we have a performance assessment? We said, and let me share you the results of our performance assessment. Together with my student, we completed a PhD thesis, and I also used the information from the PhD thesis because I think the results are important. When we talk about sustainable development goals, of course, we always think about Article 11 of the SDGs. The cities and habitats point out to the key role played by public spaces in the construction of sustainable cities. We know that the public spaces play an important role, and in the 2030 goals, this is a priority. When we look at public places, For urban public places, what can we say? A public place is a location to which all of the public has access and is not a place exclusively used for private gathering or any other personal purposes, because we also talked about social justice. That's an important key, and the United Nations consider this as a vital component of successful cities. So looking at sustainable urbanization or sustainable development, the goals are very important. When we want to measure the sustainable urbanization goals, at a global scale we have certain assessments and they are done on indexes. One is the Green City Index, the other one is the Arcadis Sustainable City Index. So looking at it in terms of the world cities competing to one another, we have different parameters to measure the competition, taking into consideration the local values. These are physical, social, and economic parameters, and there are also other parameters that change from one country to another. So what we tried to do in our study was to assess all these different cities on different indices, and as a result we saw that there are certain cities in the world that we can call as successful, and public places are also they are also successful in these fields. For instance, Vancouver, Canada has the aim to create attractive and inclusive public places. Stockholm from Sweden has the aim to develop and propose for everyone. Then Curitiba, Brazil, they want to increase recreation and public spaces in considering movement and land use together. In Cape Town, they want to be an inclusive city according to 2017-2022 development plan. And in Canberra, Australia, quality of public place, and they want to develop green areas which are well-defined character and identity. So, what can we say about Istanbul for our city? For both indices, this is the only city that makes the list of the both indices. Looking at it, Istanbul is in the top 10 Arcadis sustainable cities, and for Green City Index, it's the first city from and only city from Turkey. Of course, we talk about capacity in terms of its population, surface area, and density. We're talking about a very large city when we say Istanbul. And in terms of the density, this is the density map, by the way. And we can say that the central districts are more densely populated. We have 39 districts in Istanbul, and when we take a look at their density levels, we can say that the first and second zones, so to speak, of the city are more densely populated. Here you see the map, and according to population and density data, this shows us the ranking of Istanbul. I think you can see it on the map. So, public spaces or green spaces or public spaces are very important. This picture you see is all about how we make use of these public spaces. The picture speaks for itself. And here we can say that the level of performance according to reduced and selected 25 indicators for all cities in the world, we have selected all these parameters and we have filtered them out, and all these parameters when they are assessed, we can say that third one is public space development, or making sure that more public spaces are made available for the people. That's one target. And these parameters, combined with our goals for the future, will have an impact on the success of the city, and we try to see to what extent it really impacts this. So this is an assessment table. Green ones show the sustainable development goals. You have the districts, and when you combine the two, you see how the districts are doing in terms of attaining SDGs. The green ones are the ones that we haven't attained yet. The green one, the red ones are indicating our shortcomings. So I don't want to, rank the districts here, We have the local administrators, we have the local authorities represented here in this hall. So it's just for them to see. These are the parameters that indicate the status of the different districts. So, what about performance of municipalities? I don't want to give you the names of any district municipalities, but what we want to say here is that when we assess the performance in terms of different districts, we see that gender equality, disadvantaged groups, and transportation projects are more preferred by municipalities. We have certain centers developed for senior people, for the disabled and sick individuals. Services are provided, and to support services are provided, and municipalities also focus on maintenance of parks and park equipments. Of course, these are the things that must be there, but what we're trying to say is that, by the way, that's why I said the two previous speakers gave us a very good perspective on how these things are done in other cities. We can say that we not only need roads or sports facilities, it's not public spaces, don't mean these only, but we really need public spaces that will bring the participation of people. So, what about the projects of local administrations? These are the areas in which the Istanbul municipalities develop the highest number of projects. Institutional development and developing strategies for development is among the top priorities. Investments for social development, again, especially addressing the problems of the built environment, organizing cultural activities in which citizens can participate, and waste collection to prevent environmental pollution. These are the projects that the municipalities mainly focus on. So, we also say that for we need to also focus services that focus on social justice and environment. So, these are going to be the main parameters for our assessment as well. Of course, we shouldn't only talk about what is missing, but we should also talk about what is already there. The United Nations is now providing a guideline. So let's use it to assess our situation. We can say that we need some general policies for public places, and we expect the local administrations to develop local policies that are specific to the area, because we can say that the best local solutions can be provided by the local administrations that know the problems of the local places the best. So in terms of taking measures against climate change, we need to say that local administrations have responsibilities to play, but they need to also fulfill their own potential. Our suggestion is to create a guide for public spaces, and let me talk about the content of this guide, and then let me wrap up. We want to make sure that definitions are made in an environmental sensitive way. The previous speaker also emphasized this. UN Habitat back in 2015 published this instrument, this tool, and as it's mentioned there, and as we are trying to emphasize, there are some important topics. First of all, we need to know where we are to know where to go. Citywide public space surveys need to be made. Measuring the quality of public spaces is a must. As I said, the previous presentation was very valuable. To what extent places are accessible or usable? We need to see if they are comfortable or not, or is it just a social space? What is the dialogue of that place with the city? We need to identify this. Then we need to secure political commitment. I think Mr. Uğur will talk about it after me. Legislation and public space is important. There should be coordination between the central and local governments, and then we need to have this. As far as I know, the central government or administration or the metropolitan municipality is making great efforts. Then we need to anchor public space in national urban policies and seek synergies within governments. We need to have a street-led approach to citywide slum upgrading. We need to plan public spaces as a system. We need to use public spaces to lead development strategies. We need participation. to public space, openness, access, and sharing, and we need to ensure participation, as we said. Participation for everyone must be there, and of course, we need to leverage public spaces as a resource multiplier. Of course, all these solutions have to be based on sustainable development goals and a total objective level, and our performance assessment showed that the performance is currently not at the desired level. Having said that, I would like to thank you so much for your patience.
Mrs. Ayataç, I believe what I understood mostly from your speech is we should not create or construct just for the sake of creating or constructing areas or parks. So thank you for this constructive criticism. Our next panelist is Ms. Ebru Firidin Özgür. She'll be talking about social and spatial dimensions of public life experiences in peripheral metropolitan areas. The floor is yours.
Teşekkür ederim. Merhaba.
Thank you very much. Hello. Today I will be telling you about Pendik, something that we did in Pendik. I was invited here individually, but we are actually here as a team. And this effort was actually supported by the Mimar Sinan University. We just embarked on this journey about 2 months ago. Allow me to tell you about our conception of what a public space is. Of course, I do not have the time to go into all these details, but visibility is really important when we talk about public spaces. And also, this is at the heart of being what a city dweller is all about. There's visibility, publicity that leads to a public sphere. Habermas conceptualized this. And also at the same time, we have public spheres, and they constitute an important part of our experience in terms of equality. And actually, Doris talked about this previously. Equality for public sphere is very important. When we talk about public spaces, terminologically, we have some references, a concept, a context. When we talk about public spaces, parks, squares, streets, avenues that are open to all. As urban planners, this is what we need to give to people. It's a public service that we are responsible for, and they need to be accessible to all, and they need to be provided by the public authorities. So what do we try to do with our project that I mentioned? When you look at the literature, you see that public spheres or public sphere research is mainly concentrated on the central areas, central parks, and squares in cities. That holds true for the West and for Turkey as well. And we've been working together for the last 10 years, actually, and we have built on our past experience, and we wondered, yes, at the center there are so many studies that are being conducted, but how about the periphery of the city? How about the individuals living in the periphery? How do they experience public spaces? We wanted to focus on Pendik and two districts, two neighborhoods of Pendik, and in terms of urbanization patterns, these are really different as two neighborhoods on 3 levels: neighborhood level, sub-district level, and metropolitan level. We wanted to see what sorts of experiences people have and which public spaces and contexts do we see manifestations of these. And thirdly, and secondly actually, we wanted to find out how this is diversified by individual experiences. By individual experiences, I mean age, gender, whether they are migrants or not, whether they have a sense of belonging, education, and so on and so forth. Yes, like I said previously, we are at the beginning of this study, and we want to share with you the initial findings. And we are in stage 1 right now. Of course, we are looking at the literature, and we have some experience from Pendik, and also we do observational studies, and we make sure that we understand what sorts of facilities are offered to the dwellers of each and every neighborhood. You see in this image that well, we have data collected by Murat Güvenç. This dates back to 1995. These are recreational parks, the size of parks. Unfortunately, we have a very limited number of districts or neighborhoods that offer enough green space to people. And there's a disparity in this picture. Again, this leads to urbanization. We have some irregular construction and some gated communities, and the distribution of green areas in these areas, well, is quite imbalanced all throughout Istanbul, and also within districts, just like Pendik, there's an irregularity in terms of the distribution of these places. Pendik is to the east of Istanbul. It's a suburban area, and it's on the east-west axis. But recently, thanks to the Sabiha Gökçen Airport and the Marmara tram line, thanks to these connection opportunities, Pendik is going through a transformation. This is from 1900. You see Maltepe, Kartal, and Pendik. It's just a small suburban fisherman's village. Come 1970, we see that there is more housing, and this is the western part of the district. We also looked at the eastern neighborhood. In the 70s, with the onset of industrialization, you see a bifurcation in Pendik. In 1980, this is an aerial shot from 1980. Again, you see that Pendik is sprawling quickly. Here's an excerpt from a master thesis. 1965, 70, 86, and 014. This is the development of Pendik. After 1980, industrialization was quite intense. And between the 80s and the 2000s, there's a significant difference in terms of population as well. At first, in the 30s, Pendik actually started to receive, after the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, people coming from Greece of Turkish descent. In 65, the population was 20,000, and come 1980 and 1990, there's a huge difference, especially from 50,000 all the way up to 300,000 in 1990. Again, this is a byproduct of industrialization. And then in 2010, we see another jump, and this is because of gated communities. And when we look at Pendik, it's in the Ömerli Basin, the northern part. It's on the Tem highway, and again, you don't have many houses here. But all the way to the Tem highway, there's a lot of construction. Two neighborhoods, Orta Mahallesi and Doğu Mahallesi, you can see them here. And Pendik, actually, this is much more planned. This is like the core of Pendik, especially Doğu Mahallesi, the east neighborhood. When you look at the connections, D100, E5 highways, there's a metro line as well. There's this suburban train. And this is actually, in terms of pedestrian access, this is rather disruptive. But they facilitate access to Pendik. But when you live in Pendik, it sort of impedes access between different neighborhoods. You see some underpasses here, a couple of underpasses. The tram line, the train line is here. So this has an impact on the relationship between different neighborhoods. And also you have sea access to Pendik. When you look at the pattern of houses in the Orta neighborhood, you used to have gecekonduz or the slums way back, and now they have been transformed, so it's quite intense, but low-rise buildings. Doğu Mahallesi, on the other hand, is merged with the center, and you see more sparse and more regular structure. Let's now take a look at public spaces. I told you that we do some observations. In the Orta neighborhood, unfortunately, there is no communal space or a public space because the only park there has now been turned into a metro exit construction. But in Doğu Mahallesi, you have two streets, and Tahsin Arcan Park is here. Tahsin Arcan Park is used with the seafront park, and then you have neighborhood parks that cater to the needs of the local people. And also here are some of the activities that people use these places for: to take a walk, to rest, to go out on a picnic, and also to make things. And I will show you in a minute what I mean by making things. Orta Mahallesi, here are some pictures. Like I said, this is the only area where there used to be a park. In 2006, there was a transformation here. This park was built, but right now, as you see on this Yandex map, it is now a construction site for the metro line. So this means that there isn't much public space in this particular neighborhood. You see some pictures from the neighborhood. You see many different types of buildings. You have, single-story houses. You have apartment buildings. The streets, you don't see people in the streets, and it's quite steep as well, quite hilly, and this brings about some nice views inside the neighborhood. I talked about visibility. Now you don't see people in the streets, but still people express themselves to gain visibility. This is another wall art. This was quite befitting for Istanbul because Istanbul is famous for its cats. As for Doğu neighborhood, in this neighborhood you see a more planned urbanization, but the intensity varies. Sometimes you have 5-story houses, and sometimes you have single-story units, just like you see here. You have high-rises as well. The current trend, these are some of the buildings to be built. Residences and gated communities. And this is rather new for the Doğu neighborhood. And also, when you look at the use of the neighborhood, you see, and how people use the streets, you see flowers. That's a shared characteristic between the two neighborhoods. The backyards are generally used for car parking, and in Doğu Mahallesi, Doğu neighborhood, there's a pedestrianized street that we observed, as I said previously. Gazi Paşa Caddesi is one of them, and people go there for shopping during the day. And also, this is the Gazi Paşa square, and also people like to spend time in this place. Çarşı Mosque Square, again, this is used extensively as a square. And also there's another square called Lokman Hekim Square, and here you have people again during the day. In Doğu Mahallesi there's a potential area, the market area, but it is used only on Saturdays when there's the market, weekly market. So I think there's a potential here, but right now it is not being put to use. In the Doğu neighborhood, from north to south, there's a big park, and on the upper segments of the park, and also in the continuation of the park, you go down to the seafront park. But it's not very properly planned, so it's not used that often. The seafront park is used much more extensively, and here you have children's play areas, and exercising equipment. Another segment from the seafront park. There are people under the shadows, so people do use this park. This was quite interesting. This is what I meant by making things. These are women making dried traditional Turkish soup in a public park. So, you know, you get a wide range of activities that people are engaged in a public park setting. Someone is cooking here, someone's making tea, someone's making dried soup. So it's a great communality here. And also in the parks you see vendors, street vendors, and they also create a buzz around themselves because there's always people in these parks. Similarly, in these parks, in the weekends, people go out on picnics. That's also quite nice. So, in conclusion, here's what I'd like to say. Yes, we are at the beginning of our research. We are going to do interviews and surveys and listen to people from this point onwards, and hopefully we are going to map everything. But so far we have seen in these two neighborhoods that in Orta Mahallesi, public space is mainly limited to the gardens or the streets around the housing units. That's where it's confined to. And for men, coffee houses, tea houses are quite popular. And because this area attracted a lot of immigration, there are many associations for people coming from different parts of the country. So this is where men usually socialize. And of course, in the long run, hopefully, we are going to discover more. As for the Doğu Mahallesi, this neighborhood, it's much more central, and it offers a more diversified experience to the dwellers of Pendik. People are engaged in many different activities, and this goes to show that in urban planning, public spaces are very important, and there are certain things that we need to take into account when we plan for these areas. Just like Doris said previously, you know, we need to also have small parks that we can have access to as soon as we turn around the corner. And in terms of communality, there may be different experiences. So in literature, there's like an enumeration of activities, types of activities, but no, that's not the case. People are not limited to those lists. There are so many other different types of activities that people are engaged in these public spaces. And finally, allow me to say that public spaces are not just closed units. Yes, we look at what's in it, like whether there's benches, trees, and so on and so forth, but their value is way beyond that. Of course, we need to look at these things, but also the interaction with the proximity, geographical proximity is equally as important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Özgür. Our last panelist is Mr. Uğur İnan. He's advisor to the mayor of Fatih. I think he'll be talking about equipped, focused urban transformation. After Mr. Inan's speech, there is going to be a Q&A session. If you could send your questions through this app, I think you can download it or something. I'll be able to see your questions and just reflect them on the screen. I already have a couple of questions, but if you're interested, please take care of that problem. And Mr. Inan, the floor is yours.
Başta Sayın Moderatör olmak üzere.
First of all, I would like to greet all of you with respect, especially our moderator and our speakers. The moderator said that I am the advisor to the mayor. The mayor himself wanted to be here in person, but he had another program. That's why he wasn't able to join, but he sent you his greetings. So, I will talk about acquisition of public places. That will be the presentation. And let me say that in the last 5 years, from 2014, 2019. I served together with the mayor at the collective housing agency. So generally speaking, Istanbul has this urbanization background, and in terms of standards, of course, everyone knows that there are some problems in Istanbul in certain neighborhoods. Back in 2014, we had a study. We established certain criteria, and we also identified certain coefficients, and we tried to see all the neighborhoods in Istanbul and identify their urban transformation priorities. Then, socially and physically, we have identified some focus zones in Istanbul, from Haliç to Küçükçekmece Lake, that area between the lake and the Marmara Sea. We have a population of about 6 million people living there, and I think there are about 11 municipalities in this area. There is a massive structure here, and in terms of disaster exposure, this is the most problematic zone in Istanbul. So we focused on that area. Well, the collective housing agency generates houses by opening new housing areas for use. 85% of this is social housing. And within that framework, the houses created by establishing new settlement areas and how they could be used to diminish the number of risky structures in the existing building stock. We wanted to see how we can do this through a study, and in the plans we have certain areas that are allocated as fitting areas, but somehow there is a building or there are some occupiers in these areas. And they are of very poor quality, these buildings, these structures are of very poor quality, and they're not earthquake resistant. We have identified these areas in 11 districts, 11 municipalities. Well, I'm here representing the Fatih municipality now, but the initial idea of this project started with the collective housing agency. At that time, we had two municipalities, Fatih and Çekmece municipalities, that participated in this project. Together with the collective housing agency, of course, we initiated this project. We focused on the Fatih district, where we have the old walls of the city walls. This area is shown as a fitting area in the plans. And based on these axes where the walls stretch, you can see, by the way, on the map, we have buildings with 1 or 2 stories, very, very primitive buildings. And on the plans, these buildings are shown as green spaces, by the way. So, in the new housing areas, we have certain standards in new houses. So we wanted to pay the owners of these old houses the money for their land and transfer them to the newly built collective houses and transform these old houses into green spaces. We signed a protocol in 2012. We're talking about a space of 20,000 square meters to be regenerated or transformed, let's say. We had about 30 households that were transferred to the houses that were constructed in Kayabaşı with good standards. And the remaining amount of money that they had to pay in exchange of this transfer, they were able to pay it in installments up to 10 to 12 years, 20 years, just like they are paying a rent. They will be paying for the new houses in exchange of this. So we came to a reconciliation with the residents. And of course, in this project, first you identify the people who are entitled to this transfer, and we calculate the amounts of money and the value of their existing houses, and the houses, new houses that they will be transferred to, they are shown these houses and asked if they want to live in this new house or not. If the resident accepts, then the project goes on. So these are the new houses that we have given to these people. Of course, they have a certain quality. They have certain standards. Here, according to the initial plan, we had 30 houses, and we have gained about 6,000 square meters of parking areas. By the way, according to the plans, these areas were green areas or fitting areas, and they had illegally built risky building stock on them. So we have destroyed the illegally built building stock. And in the next phase of the project at Ayvansaray Municipality, upon our demand, we have taken 2 plots of land with a square meter of 20,000. So we are asking for 70 residential units here. Here, they are within the walls of Istanbul. And these are the new residential houses suggested or proposed to these people if they want to move. So what is the outcome of this project? Let me explain. We have these public housing spaces. You create a new settlement area, you grow the city in a way. So the residential area, which is risky and which is planned as a green area, green space, is now used in a way to benefit the municipalities. And of course, these spaces will be allocated to residential units with higher living standards. In terms of public interest, we have identified certain articles. By the way, when I say public interest, I mean the stakeholders. Thanks to this project, first of all, we will be disposing of the risky building stock. We will give opportunity to the settlements and cities to have a balanced development. We will decrease the density in residential areas. We want to give the opportunity to reside in safe houses that are earthquake resistant for citizens. We want to increase the amount of green spaces. We want to increase the living standards. And based on reconciliation, we want to get rid of negative reactions. We want to use the public resources in the optimum, in the most optimum way possible. And we want to protect the walls of the city, which are actually under the UNESCO Cultural Heritage. side, and then it will also have some benefits for disasters. The benefits for the people who are entitled to move to the new houses, first of all, we can say that they are not losing any of their rights. Now they are able to live in legal houses because they used to live in illegal houses. These people have the chance to live in higher standard spaces now. They have the chance to own an affordable house, and the remaining amount of money they need to pay is going to be paid in long-term installments. And of course, in terms of the environment, these park areas or fitting areas will be available for the use of public, and the environmental standards will be increased, so the value of the green areas will be increasing. And for the municipality, the benefits are the following. Process management is shortened, the economic burden of expropriation is relieved, and the money could be used for other services. In terms of resources, the municipality will have more resources now, and loss of labor will be prevented because of decreased bureaucracy. For the collective housing agency, we can say that the benefits are that we have fulfilled our mission. So, in conclusion, these are the things that I wanted to say. The new residential areas and the old residential areas, we wanted to use the new residential areas to lower the risk in the old risky residential areas. So this new model will be very important for Istanbul and other cities as well.
Mr. İnan for his speech. Now it's time for the Q&As. Let me see if I can bring the questions to the plaza. Evet, sorum tüm konuşma.
Yes, this question is for all the panelists. Accessibility for all is something that we discussed, but why do we see the old and new states of parks? How about the disabled people for their accessibility? Do you not work at all? Why have you not touched upon the issues faced by the disabled?
Buyurun hocam.
Şuradan açılıyor sanıyorum. Esasında
Well, actually, yes, we do work on this. We do carry out work on this, and I actually teach on this, but when I say accessibility for all or inclusiveness, this is what I mean. So actually, yes, maybe I didn't specifically talk about the disabled, but being inclusive also encompasses that. We do not differentiate between people. When we say for all, we mean for all. There could be all sorts of disabilities, restrictions, be it physical or economical. This is what I mean by inclusiveness. All right, thank you. Next question.
Ristani, the center area is great for people and I love it, but how traffic affected by this design?
Yes, it's not. So I didn't explain I didn't explain the whole story. We started it very gradually. So we said the center is basically where everybody would go to go anywhere in the city. But they didn't have to, because there were roads around the city that you could just take you just as easily. But by people thinking that you could just go straight through the city to any other direction, the way they were wired was that this is where the cars had to go. So it was more of a behavior and psychological problem than it was a technical one. So we started experimenting with closing that whole area before construction started and closing it for the cars during the weekend. So on the first day, it was a disaster. We got cursed, we got yelled at, it was a mess. But then people realized that that wasn't the only route they could take. And it wasn't necessarily just the destination, it was just a passage. And so we should treat our centers as a destination per se. It's not a place you go through to get into your next destination. It's just the situation, the setting is where you live, is where you want it to go. And so it was solved, though. There was some intervention required, and one of the things we did was also to have an underground parking, so the space on top is the same, but then for people who have business in the vicinity, they can just park and they walk to all the neighboring institutions, which are the main government institutions. So yes, it was hard in the first day. We started replicating it almost every week, and then by the end, when construction started, nobody even realized that that was never there. So.
Okay, actually, there is another follow-up question for you. I'm not sure if it's on the screen, but you said you give priority to the pedestrians before planning public places, but in countries like ours, where there's always a traffic congestion, priority is not given to the pedestrians. If it were, drivers would get mad, and it would have some implications. So someone is asking, what are your suggestions for that?
I think it's a work in progress for all of us, not just for us, for Albanians especially, the car was a status symbol. So it was something you didn't have before, but now you had the possibility to own it, to have it, and to show it off to everybody else. So it elevated in its importance more than a vehicle into a more symbolic presence. And I think it was worshipped a lot more than it should have. But that's a problem with all of our societies right now. One of the things we're doing is that we are trying to eliminate segments that are shorter. So, for example, in Tirana, out of 800,000 trips that people were taking every day with their car, half of them were less than 1 kilometer. Now, you don't need a car for 1 kilometer, but it's not just me. I mean, all scholars are saying that the best way to control this and to basically smooth down the driver arrogance is to make parking more expensive. And I think that once that happens in the macro scale, that makes everybody more aware of the fact that the car is not a human right. But living and breathing is a human right. So in that sense, I think it's still a work in progress, but us as administrators, our job is to basically enforce what really is the logical right. And what is the logical right is that for priority there's to pedestrians, space should be prioritized to pedestrians, and it shouldn't be them who sacrifice their mobility, but it should be this vehicle, this soulless vehicle, who should instead, have a more round way to its next destination.
So just briefly, because there are a lot of questions on that,
Sure.
how disabled children, are they able to go to the parks, and are they able to socialize with other children at the parks?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that question. Today is the International Walk to School or Bike to School Day. And I was looking at the pictures that my colleagues were sending me. We closed a few roads so that for kids who live very close to their homes, who go to school very close to their homes, they could actually walk to school. And we have volunteers who help them on those intersections when they have to cross the road to basically hold their hand and cross it. So that also educates, the arrogant drivers that we're talking about. But yes, the kids in Albania are very active, and they don't have, Western kind of sleeping style. So you can find them even even at 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening to play because weather is so favorable. But the parks are a great idea. Our next step, though, is to integrate them with the space with the space around the school, because it's kind of like the bike lanes. If you do not, if they do not intersect each other, if you just create lanes that don't have a grid and don't have a path, you're not encouraging bikers. Also for the kids, if they can go safely to school, but then they need an adult to go to the park after school, again, you're not integrating them, you're not giving them this independence. So attendance has been great in terms of parks. In Tirana, I think numbers show that those are some of the most consumed parks ever because of the high demand. But the next step is to integrate them with the space where kids go to school, and with using the schools as very good real estate assets for other than schooling. So they can, go do sports after school. They can go play in the playground of the school or of the kindergarten, and they can use that as also an alternative to the park, because it makes parents' lives easier and it makes kids, use them better.
Okay, Ms. Ristani, thank you. And the next question is for Professor Özgür. Says, it's in blue, guys, so I cannot put it up, so I'm just reading here. I manage a park in New York, and there's a permit requirement for events and vending. Though helpful from management perspective, it can be an obstacle. Is there such a structure for parks here? If not, how can this be leveraged for more programming? This is for you. This question is for you, yes. Yes, sure. So I manage a park in New York City, and there's a permit requirement for events and vending. Though helpful from management perspective, it can be an obstacle. Is there such a structure for parks here? If not, how can this be leveraged for more programming? Yes, that's an example for New York, and I think he asks or she asks about this situation in Turkey and Istanbul. And your microphone, please.
Şimdi uluslararası ölçek
Now, on an international scale for the disabled, there's a lot of projects that are going on. I mainly focus on this as well, but here, like I said previously, we focus more on rehabilitation. This is what I criticize the most, what I focus on the most. And today, perhaps I didn't emphasize this, but especially for the disabled, we are trying to make sure that we can preserve, what we do in Turkey, we try to bring services to home, we care for them at home, and we try to fulfill our responsibilities in this manner. So my personal view is that local authorities mainly adopt this point of view. So I think this is something that we need to tackle. Yes, people have different disabilities, and yes, we care for them, but mainly we shut them out of the public spaces. We keep them at home, and I think that is wrong. That's why what we want to achieve, and for disabled people, we have had many projects, and if the person who asked this question is here, I can talk to them about this. But the main objective here is making sure that everyone has access to public spaces. And regardless of the country, even in the developed nations, even in the countries that have found the best solutions, there is still room for improvement. And like I said, we need to make sure that people can enjoy public spaces. Because with them, only with them, can we be a society as a whole. I don't know if I have answered your question. Maybe you can touch upon a few points. Yes, I'd like to add a couple of things. In parks, in big squares, certain events organize certain events, and I think that's something that we all support. But mainly, these are privatized efforts. I mean, if there's an entrance fee, for instance, these are private events, should be classified as private events, and that's how we see them. But of course, these things need to take place. And here's the situation in Turkey. I don't know about what's going on in New York, but in Turkey, if in a square, if at a park, if you want to organize an event, you need the permission of the relevant municipality as well as the governor's office for security reasons. All right. One more question for İnan, urban transformation, renovation projects. These are desperately needed in Turkey, but buildings usually are turned into luxury residence projects instead of just making them earthquake resistant. Let me explain. Yes, there's a supply and demand mechanism in the market. I don't know how much people need luxury housing units, but I used to work in the collective housing agency, and 85% of our buildings were on social housing. So that's important. Affordable housing is what we always wanted to achieve. And the remaining, as for the remaining percentage, the high-end housing units, it's due to the demand in the market. And of course, the existing, when you look at the now 85%, well, you need financing for the remaining 85%, so that's an explanation. Since the beginning of 2003 all the way up to 2019, 850,000 housing units were built. We were established in 84. Until year 2000, only 43,000 units were built. But like I said, in the last 19 years, we've almost built 1 million units, more than 85% of which are social housing units. So we're talking about roughly 700. Of course, sometimes crises have an impact on this, but on average, we built all these units, and 9% of this is done by the collective housing agency. 85%, more than 85%, is social housing, like I said. And as I said previously, people can afford these houses just like they pay rent. Very briefly, and then I have a question for Gstach. The Kayabaşı district, the people you sent there, did they agree with you that it was a nice area? Where did they express this view, this project? Actually, it was last year. The move was last year, at the beginning of this year actually, and regarding the users, we have satisfaction surveys, and we do track these things. We get this feedback, and especially in an area where there's no zoning permit, if people are living in dilapidated conditions, that's not good. We have sort of elevated the living standards for these people. Together with their neighbors, we have carried them over to somewhere nicer, and I think, it's not such a repulsive idea. And also, here's the thing, economically, if people want to not do that, there are options. People always have the option not to go to these places, so we offered an option to people. And by doing this, we are trying to mitigate the risks. We are trying to devise this mechanism, because in these new areas, you have better facilities, and you also need to deal with the risky building stock at the heart of the city. That's why this is so important. This is very much important for the welfare of all parties involved. But we have explained this to 9 or 10 municipalities. People loved it, but in terms of implementation, only 2 municipalities at the time gave the approval. Fatih Belediyesi being one of them. But like I said, for all parties involved, this was the best way out. It offered many advantages, this approach. So I think this is important. All right, thank you very much. One last question to Gstach. If you were to compare Istanbul and Europe, or Istanbul, Europe and Turkey in terms of access to green areas and environmental justice, what are your thoughts? How does Turkey fare in this regard?
Ms. Gstach, this is for you.
I think it's hard to compare on this broad level. And I probably don't know Istanbul that well that I can really do a comparison. But let's say I experience it as a very dense city, very lively city. And you have to have a broader or a closer look into the very local specifics. So
I'm not actually, I think he's not actually asking for specifics, but as for a comparison, I mean, maybe you can compare one European country to another if you have no knowledge about this particular city, but how people have access, do they have access to equal parks or environmental justice? Do they exercise that?
Different cities do better than others, yes, throughout the world. There are cities who put a lot of effort into green space provision. There are good examples. In Germany, probably Munich is a very good example. They have quite rigid regulations also going with it. So it's not just a policy, but they also have kind of further regulations how to go towards that goal. In other countries, we know that New York City actually is very ambitious about green space development. Also Australia, Sydney as well as Canberra are doing very well and have very ambitious programs towards that. Also Scandinavian cities like Copenhagen and Stockholm are doing very well. So there are cities, it's not so much countries, I would say, which have a specific effort. It's always on the local level, on the city level, where some cities put effort on that topic and others
just
probably less, let's say.
Okay, we have come to the end of our panel. Thank you very much for your presentations, for your input, and thank you very much for listening to us and raising your questions. I hope you're satisfied. Thank you.